Lord have mercy. It feels good up in here, yes, yes. I'm reminded of the lesson in A Course in Miracles, one of the lessons in this past week. God being love is also happiness. And it says in the lesson, to fear God is to fear joy. And so we recognize that we are blessed always, that we are happy always. We recognize that we are completely in the vibration of who and what God is. Course in Miracles also teaches us that it is God's will for our perfect happiness. And so that's why we affirm, I am happy always, for the arms of God surround us. Thank you, Pastor Yolanda. Thank you, Soul 21. Thank you to the Celebration Band. All right. So we have a few things to cover, so I'm going to dig right in as we are in our series, Who is Jesus to Me? In the past 2 weeks, we started on Easter Sunday with Reimagine Easter, recognizing and realizing that in order to even really look at the Jesus story in a way that relates to us, we have to reimagine the Easter story and recognizing that it's not just about some man that lived thousands of years ago, but it's actually about us, because the path of the Christ is a journey that each and every one of us must take and are taking unknowingly many times. And then when we understand how the path works and we understand that victory is always on the other side, this is why we appreciate the path of our sun, which is showing us the same thing, that the sun goes down in the depths of the southern hemisphere into the darkness, and we experience darkness here in the northern hemisphere, but it always emerges, yes, yes. And this is why we celebrate spring. This is why we celebrate Easter in spring, the awakening, the trees, the buds, the flowers, they're all showing up. I took beautiful pictures of some daffodils I saw yesterday in Manhattan. I just love seeing those flowers. Last week, we talked about the next revolution. I talked about this idea that we recognize what's going on in our country right now. We're experiencing revolutionary times that harken back to the times of the 60s, when we looked at the revolution that happened there with the women's movement and the feminist movement, and of course the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And we go back a little further and we look at what took place during the Civil War, which was a revolution, and of course the American Revolution. And here we are now experiencing another revolution. And what I offered is that there's something that we need to embrace and understand in order to actually succeed in this next revolution. It's a word that seems counterintuitive: compassion. Understanding what compassion is all about. I encourage you to go back to that message. It was a powerful message, but it's the crux and heart of what Jesus taught as a radical revolutionary, and he was a radical revolutionary. He said, he taught this idea of be compassionate as God is compassionate. That word is generally translated as merciful, and it's really not the best translation. When we understand that compassion means to feel with, and then if we understand that in that the Hebrew and Aramaic word that's used is actually the plural form of the word womb. What we're being asked to do and be is to be like a womb, like God is like a womb. And so in order to have a revolution, we have to give birth to it, which means we have to allow this thing to inhabit our own being, to be like a womb, like God is like a being, and give birth to this thing. Powerful message. Go back to it. It's on YouTube and other places. So as I was preparing for this message and meditating on this message this week, my mind took me to a show that I loved as a child. How many people loved Reading Rainbow? Yeah. Now, Reading Rainbow was awesome for a bunch of reasons. I mean, you know, LeVar Burton, he hosted Reading Rainbow, and that was cool. We got this awesome theme song sung by Shaka Khan, right? And as I was thinking about Reading Rainbow, it reminded me of something, because, you know, LeVar Burton, he would talk about a book, and then when he was done talking about the book, what would he say? He would say, but you don't have to take my word for it, right? And so I thought about that, and I'm invoking that same spirit as we're talking about this subject today, if Jesus went to India. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, right? And I want to recommend some books. Now, one book, if you only look at one book, I encourage you to check out Jesus, The Explosive Story of the 30 Lost Years and the Ancient Mystery Religions by Tricia McCannon. And the reason why I recommend this book is because everything else that we talk about, you'll find highlighted in this text. It's a very thick text. It's a textbook. It's written from an academic, scholarly perspective, so all of the footnotes, all of the goodies are in there, right? So it's not just someone just writing randomly about this idea of Jesus potentially having been to India, but she's actually giving you sources and resources that you can then continue to read and investigate. Great text. It's a text that's been with me for a long time. And so this idea of Jesus went to India, how many people have ever heard or entertained this idea that Jesus went to India, right? Now, it doesn't, of course, necessarily correlate with what we have in the canonized Gospels, right? But we also recognize that in the canonized Gospels, there are, as the title of Tricia McCannon's text says, there are 30 lost years. We really don't get a lot in terms of what happened and what Jesus was up to. We get the magnificent birth, right? And, you know, Bethlehem and the manger and the wise men and the shepherds, and then, like, nothing, right? We know that Mary and Joseph fled down to Egypt. We have his first miracle. He was a teenager, but there's all these years that we just don't know what happened. And then he shows on the scene, and we get these fabulous 3 years of ministry. Well, there are a lot of texts that talk about what happened during those years. Now, one, I'm sure is familiar to many, is the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus, the Christ, by Levi Dowling. This is from 1908. Now, what's interesting about this text, Levi Dowling writes in this text that Jesus indeed went to India and studied in India. But one of the unfortunate things about this text, at the time it wasn't so much a widespread phenomenon, but what we would consider this text today would be a channeled text. And so because it was a channeled text, he says that he received it from the Akashic records, right? And so because of that, we don't have any other sources. There's no way, we can't bring our academic or scholarly minds and look and see, oh, okay, he was referring to this particular text, or he got this idea from another text. There's no way to corroborate what he's saying. I'm not saying it's not true. It's just there's no way to corroborate it because it's a channeled text, and it has value, right? But then we also have another text, The Nine Faces of Christ by Eugene Whitworth. And what Eugene Whitworth is talking about in The Nine Faces of Christ is the initiatory path that Jesus would have had to go through in order to become the Christ. And understanding that this is the same path that each and every one of us must go to. And so he talks a lot about, and writes about the mystery schools and understanding things that we talk about here, understanding that there's the physical sun, and the path of the physical sun is actually teaching us the path of initiation. But behind the physical sun is the spiritual sun, which is the soul or the light that dwells within us. And so in The Nine Faces of Christ, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what Whitworth writes, he gives us some more information on what happened with Jesus and what he learned in India. Now, there's another text, and this one is interesting. The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ by Nicholas Notovich, a Russian. And this was in 1894. What was interesting about Notovich, he was traveling in the East. He was traveling in Tibet, and he was injured. And some, I guess they would be Buddhist monks, actually, took him in and took care of him, and he gained their trust. And as he gained their trust, they began to show him some texts, some things, some scrolls. And it was found that in these texts and in these scrolls, they were writing about a man named Saint Isa. And actually, originally, this text, The Unknown Life of Jesus the Christ, was also called the Life of Saint Isa. And so what Nicholas Notovich did is he began to take all of these writings that he was reading in the scrolls and began to put them together and organize them in chronological order. And it talks about how Jesus came to India and how this was a part of his path to initiation, and what he did and where he lived and what he learned. Some wonderful things in that text. And then after Notovich, then we have another brother by the name of Swami Abhedananda, who was from India, but also he was educated in the West, right? He was educated in Britain. And he went to corroborate what we read from Notovich. And so he wrote Journey into Kashmir and Tibet. Now, what's interesting, and this is why I talked about this from the aspect of Levi Dowling, because the Swami was educated in the West, he understood the Western mind, right? He understood that, you know, the Western mind needs sources and needs footnotes and needs proof, right? And so he wrote from that perspective. That was his perspective. He believed what Notovich had written, but he recognized that many would not believe it without this corroborating evidence. And so that's what we have from his text written in 1922. And so Tricia McCannon, she writes this about Notovich's work, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. Notovich relates how Jesus came to India to study with the Brahmins and how they taught him to heal the sick, perform exorcisms, and read the Vedas. So, if Jesus went to India, there are a few questions. What did he learn? What did he teach? And what does this mean to us today? Right? Because it's cool information, but I'm not interested in just cool information, right? If it's not useful to us today, it's useless. So if Jesus went to India, what did he learn? Well, there's some beautiful things that he learned. One, we know that there is where he received the instruction in meditation. There is also where, according to the story, he learned and studied yoga and became masterful. It is also said that in that time, in his early years in study, this is then where he also learned breathing techniques like Nadi Shodhana, right? Recognizing that we can actually use our breathing to awaken the Kundalini energy within us. As I've already read, of course, he studied the Vedas. Now, why is this important? Because we recognize that the Vedic writings in Sanskrit is the oldest ancient spiritual writings that we know of. Right? It predates the Bible, even the oral tradition of the Bible, First Testament, we're talking now, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, all of that, predates it by thousands of years, right? And then we also see what's beautiful when we get to the Gospels, and we look at the book of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. That was actually written in Sanskrit thousands of years before. Beautiful. And so he studied these texts. The other thing he got and understood was a deeper understanding of the Divine Mother. And it's said that behind the forces of the male gods, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, lies the presence of the Divine Mother, the eternal divinity of unconditional love. In the East, this exquisite goddess has been known by many different names, familiar to many of you, among them Devi, Parvati, Durga, Sita, Radha, and Lakshmi. In Judaism, she is Sophia. We talked about this. In the Proverbs, we have that word wisdom, which is Sophia, and it's always referred to in the feminine as she, the goddess of wisdom. In Christianity, she is the Shekinah, or Holy Spirit. And then we find this echoed, although we don't see it so much in the canonized Gospels, when we look to the apocryphal or the extra-biblical texts like the Sophia of Jesus Christ, the wisdom of Jesus Christ. Or in the Essene Gospel of Peace, what we see over and over again is he's admonishing us to love our mother and look at our mother. And so this really takes me into even what did he teach while he was in India. As he learned this idea of the Divine Mother, then he taught to love and respect women and the divine feminine. And in Notovich's text, he writes this, and he says that these are the words of Jesus. Listen then to what I say unto you. Respect woman, for she is the mother of the universe, and all the truth of the divine creation lies in her. On her depends the whole existence of man, for she is his natural and moral support. Bless her and worship her, for she is your one friend, your one support on earth. Respect her, uphold her. In acting thus, you will win her love and her heart. You will find favor in the sight of God. This is what Jesus taught in India. And it's interesting to me because then this sheds light on the presence of women all throughout his ministry and how he interacted with women continuously. Not only the fact that there was a large following of women that were his disciples, right? They were called disciples. They weren't secondary citizens, right? Although it's been redacted and rewritten, Mary Magdalene was one of his key disciples. She was not a prostitute either, right? Now, we also recognize that women were the primary people that financed his ministry, right? There were wealthy women that were his disciples. They financed his ministry, important. And then, of course, we see again, over and over again, how he interacted with women. And so we can't say that Jesus was a feminist. I can't say that because, in the context of this time, I can't say that he was a feminist, but he understood this powerful and even higher concept, right? That we must love and respect all women, for she is the mother of the universe, and all the truth of divine creation lies in her. Now, another thing he taught was that being human is important and valuable. In Notovich's text, we read this: Life cannot be improved from the spiritual plane alone. Human life is improved by human qualification of divine energy. The spiritual energy must be qualified by the human mind, agitated by great emotion to bring about the curing of disease or the raising of dead nature. Now, what is he saying there? What is he admonishing us to? We've heard the idea, not to be so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly good. And unfortunately, many times what happens is that because of this teaching that human beings are inherently bad, wrong, and sinful, right? Taking the literal reading of the Adam and Eve story, then we think that there's something wrong with being human. But what he's saying to us is that we actually don't get to fully express who and what we are as divine beings except through our human nature. It reminds me of one of our value statement here at CSC. We say in worship, we celebrate God. That's what we're doing here. We're having a worship experience and we're celebrating the God in us. In prayer, we know God. We know the truth. In meditation, we contact God. It is absolutely possible, and we do it. We contact the ground of all being, consciousness itself. But then in living, we activate God. It's important to live, right? You can't just be in worship and meditation and prayer all day long and, I'm just so spiritual and, I'm just, life. No, life cannot be improved from the spiritual plane alone. It has to be expressed. And you are the expression of God. I mean, when we think about this idea of us being God's good idea, as everything comes from thought, that means that you were contemplated. That means you were thought about over and over and over again until you manifest it. In the same way that any good idea that comes to you in your mind, you think about it, you meditate on it, you sit with it, you smile, you think about all the ways that you can implement it, and then you implement it. It comes into being. So you are the same. And so there's a recognition God could have just been happy with thinking about you. But if it was just happy with thinking about you, you would not be able to manifest and express, activate this thought that was a thought in the mind of God. And so these are the things that Jesus was teaching. Now, finally, this is my favorite part of what he taught while he was in India. He taught that all people have a right to life, knowledge, and happiness. Now, if we know a little something about the history of India, what do we know about the separation and otherness that still exists in this country, the caste system? Yes. This idea that and it's a spiritual idea as well as a physical idea, that based on what you did in your past life, you're going to be born into a certain set of circumstances. And some people are better than you, and some of you are so bad you're called untouchables. You're so unworthy, you can't even hear the scriptures except for, I think it's the untouchables, where they're only allowed to hear the scriptures once a year during a special holiday, and they can never touch or read them themselves. That's how unworthy the untouchables supposedly are. Interesting. But Jesus taught something different, and in The 9 Faces of Christ, Whitworth writes this: in defiance of God, he has taught that all men are equal. In defiance of reason, he has taught that untouchables are as divine as Brahmins. In defiance of truth, he has taught that karma is not ever enduring. In defiance of love, he has taught that Brahmins are not pure and perfect. In defiance of training, he has taught that all men have a right to life, liberty, from caste and such happiness as the flesh may know. In defiance of teaching, he has taught that a guru is not necessary to help a man reach the supreme. In defiance of the Vedas, he has taught that there is not one single law which is sacred and divine. In defiance of the law of the land, he has taught resistance to authority and breaking of caste. In defiance of justice, he has taught the taking of food from the lands of the Brahmins to save lives of common people at times of famine. And so these are the words, as it's written in Whitworth, these are the words of those that were in power, saying that he was defying all of these things that seemed to be truth to them, that seemed to be love to them, that seemed to be justice to them. This is what Jesus was teaching. So guess what happened? The powers that be were not happy. And there was a plot to kill him. Right? Before he even gets to Jerusalem and goes through all that other stuff, right? There was already a plot to kill him. And according to the story, beautifully enough, the 3 wise men that had been following him and really protecting him from birth, they got the news, they got to India and scooped him up in the middle of the night to take him away. And there is then actually where he began to study Buddhism. And there's more wonderful things that happens there, the life of Saint Isa. It's said that Buddha prophesied that another would come just like him 500 years later. And so Buddhists believe that Jesus, the Christ, was indeed the incarnation of Buddha. For me, I've always said, once I began to study Buddhism and I read the words of Buddha, it was like I was reading words I had known in my whole life. Because I had been reading the words of Jesus. I knew the words of Jesus, but reading the words of Buddha was like I was reading from the same mouth, the same voice, the same mind, the same thinker. So it's interesting to think about this idea that Jesus was considered by Buddhists of that time to be Buddha, to be the next incarnation of Buddha. And so I'm actually almost done. Because this last question is really the only question that matters. This is good information, right? It's good, right? And again, I encourage you to get Tricia McCannon's book, or if you want to go back to Nicholas Notovich's The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, Eugene Whitworth, The 9 Faces of Christ, or Journey into Kashmir and Tibet. Wonderful texts, right? Wonderful texts, wonderful ideas, wonderful teachings. But with all of this wonderful information, it's just information if we can't use it. And so what does it mean to us today? Well, I began to think about one of the stories that we hear and read in the Gospels. In the Gospel of John. We don't read it in all the Gospels. A story that's familiar to us. And it takes me back to this idea of how Jesus dealt with everyone in his life, but specifically the compassion that was always demonstrated when he encountered and interacted with women, whether it was the woman at the well, whether it was the woman with the alabaster jar. I was reminded of the story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. Now, this story, oh, Lord, this story. It's interesting to me for so many reasons, right? Now, we just got to say this, right? We hear the story and we read the story, and it's not the story of the woman and the man that were caught in the act of adultery, right? The focus of the story was on this woman. And one of the things that I have to highlight here in terms of this text, as I said, it only occurs in the Gospel of John. There's a lot of scriptural debate about whether this actually happened. One of the reasons is not just because it only appears in one of the Gospels. That's fine. But what we find is that out of there are over 1,000 ancient texts, ancient scrolls that contain the Gospel of John. Only about 200 of them, just over 200, contain this story. And where we find the story, it's in different places and in different parts of the text. At some points, it flows through kind of like you're telling a story, and so this was the next scene. At other times, it just shows up at the very end of John, just out of position. There's no flow. In other places, it's in the book of Luke. It's not in John. The Gospel of Luke, it's not a book. And so there's some debate about whether or not this story actually happened. But one of the things that we understand is that what may have happened, and this is what happens with a lot of the Gospels, there's a text known as Q. It's an unknown text that hasn't been discovered. But we recognize that most of the Gospels are based on Q. And what Q really is a bunch of sayings. And then these sayings were taken and were animated, if you will, and the narrative was created around these sayings. So what I believe is that these sayings then, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, or when Jesus says, neither do I condemn you, or neither do I accuse you, go and sin no more. These potentially were sayings from Jesus that were then placed in the context of this story, or maybe the story happened, but not in the way that it was said, and of course it was embellished, as all of these stories have been over time, because they started orally. It's interesting, as last week we talked about Dr. Martin Luther King, and we're 50 years after his assassination, but if you listen to the stories even about those who walked with him, they don't all tell the story the same way. And we're in recent history. So when you think about the oral tradition of recent history with video evidence, how much more when we get back thousands of years to think about how these stories were told and told and told. And it was in some cases 30 or more years before anything was written. So it makes sense that this is what happened. But as I thought about this story of this woman who was accused, and of course, in the story, we recognize that the powers that be, the religious zealots of his time, were really trying to catch him. right? Because they're like, you're this great teacher. So now we found this woman, and she was with this man who wasn't her husband. And the law says that anyone that is found in the very act of adultery, this person should be stoned to death. So Jesus, teacher, if you're such this great, profound, amazing teacher, what are you going to do now with this? You've been running around here forgiving people's sins and telling them that they're free. Well, this woman can't be free. Jesus is unbothered and unmoved. According to the story, it says he was sitting on the ground and was drawing in the ground, just writing. And then he looks up and he says one of the most profound things. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Let any of y'all men, it's Sunday, I can't use the other word. Any of y'all that are without mistakes, throw the first stone. And what happens? All of them get real quiet real quick. They had to drop those stones. And before you knew it, the whole crowd had walked away. And so then, in the story, it says Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Women, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she looks around. I always think about that scene because I just can imagine the sense of terror she was in. Right, because that means they went into the home and snatched her out. Again, left this other dude. Nobody knows anything about this man. Right? We don't know. The story doesn't say. We don't know if she was clothed or not. And this is out in public. This mob. But she looks around and realizes there's nobody there but a compassionate voice. She says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "No one." And he easily and effortlessly says, "Neither do I accuse you, neither do I condemn you. Go and make no more mistakes." And as I thought about that, I had to think about what's going on in our country right now and what is being done in the name of the United States of America. Because I believe that just as we are standing in this, looking at this story and understanding what Jesus taught, which is very much in alignment with what he was doing in India, speaking out against the caste system, reminding everyone that they were loved beyond measure, that they were worthy, that you don't need a guru to achieve any type of spiritual enlightenment. We have a country that is seemingly trying to enact justice. Because a brother named Assad is doing some awful things. Yes, he is. He's doing some awful things. Using chemical weapons on your own people. It's awful. It's terrible. But the United States of America is picking up stones. And echoing the words of Jesus, I say to the United States of America, to those that are making this decision, to the White House, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Now, I'm not talking about individually. I'm not talking about 45 and his individual shortcomings. Because we all have them. Let's be clear. But what I am talking about is the United States of America. It's been said, according to one report, I think this was a Business Insider, that over 118 Tomahawk missiles were fired upon Syria. Each of those missiles cost $1.4 million. You do the math, that means over $165 million was just exploded. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And it's interesting, I'm sure many of you saw this. I shared it on Facebook last night. A sister by the name of Amber Zirkelbach. She wrote these words when asked, "Do you support the missile attack on Syria?" She said, "I'm just thankful that Syria didn't bomb us for poisoning the children of Flint or gassing natives at Standing Rock." let he who is without sin cast the first stone. If we have $165 million to blow up, then that means that we have $165 million to clean up the water in Flint and to make sure that the residents of Flint for the next 5, 10, 20 years don't have to pay for water at all. If we have $165 million to blow up, these $1.4 million stones to throw at Assad, then that means that we have the money to increase our education system and maybe begin to seed free college tuition for all. Yes, yes. And so we recognize that the teachings of Jesus are 100% relevant to today. When we ask this profound question, who is Jesus to me? Let us go to these teachings and understand that this brother was teaching us how to live not only victorious in our individual lives, but understanding that we have the responsibility and the right to speak to those in power and remind them of the truth as well. And so as he spoke against the caste system, not by necessarily speaking out against the caste system directly, but what he did was he empowered the individual. This is why what we do at CSC is so profound. Because we recognize that as Pastor Yolanda and I continue to teach and support and remind you that you're worthy, that you're the light of the world, that you're divine, that you have power, that you have the power of thought to create anything and everything you want, that is the spark that will then ignite the movement. Because the movement can only happen if the individuals understand who we are. And if we understand who we are individually, then collectively we come together and we create something so powerful. But again, as we talked about last week, this power that we're operating from is a power of compassion. Understanding what compassion is. Before every miracle, it's written, and moved with compassion, Jesus healed the sick. And moved with compassion, he fed the thousands. And moved with compassion, he raised the dead. So moved with compassion, let us remember that each of us have made mistakes. And there is someone, maybe in our lives directly or indirectly, that we get to operate as Jesus did and ask that person, where are your accusers? And as there are none, then we can say in love and with compassion, neither do I accuse or condemn you. Go and sin no more. Go and be free. Go and live from your worthiness. Go and live from the greatest, highest possible idea of yourself. With that, I invite everybody to stand. We are in powerful times. And we have the opportunity to live out and create a great, great nation. I believe that's the only reason any of these things are coming up. They're showing up so we can collectively heal them. So that we can collectively speak out and make our voices known. That we are not in alignment with spending all of this money, millions of dollars, to throw stones. And we are actually not in the moral position as a country to throw stones. And so we recognize that we need to go within as a country and heal and heal and heal and heal and heal and forgive. Then we can stand in the world. But then what's beautiful is when we're standing in that position from the perspective of the world, it won't require missiles or bombs for us to support change. It won't require us to throw stones. Because then we'll be able to say, look at us. We have enacted and supported crimes within our own nation and turned the other way. But we've now done the work. We've now done the work of reconciliation. We've now done the work of healing. We've now done the work of forgiveness. We've now done the work of unification. And so then we get to stand as the example. It won't take missiles. And we will truly be leaders again on this planet. So as we take a deep breath in and we release, Mother, Father, God, I am so grateful and so thankful that truth crushed to earth will rise again. We recognize that for many different reasons, this information, this knowledge that our elder brother Jesus studied in India, that our elder brother Jesus lived and learned in India and began to teach these powerful teachings in India. We're so grateful that this truth that was crushed to earth, this truth that was hidden, this truth that was suppressed, this truth that was pushed aside is now here for all of us to read, all of us to study, all of us to enjoy, and most importantly, for all of us to apply to our individual lives right here and right now. Because these teachings are just as true as they were thousands of years ago. That you, Mother, Father God, live within us. That there is the divine presence of the mother that is goddess that we must worship and we must love and we must adore and we must respect. This truth that all of us are created equally and have equal access to full happiness. That we all have equal access to, as our country says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this has always been true for every individual on the planet. And so right here and right now in this moment, first we choose to embrace this reality for ourselves. This reality of life, liberty, and happiness. The scripture says where the Spirit is, there is liberty, there is freedom. And it says that the truth will make you free. So as we entertain the truth, as we meditate on the truth, as we look at the truth over and over again, as we hear and receive the truth, we are being freed. We are being freed in our minds. We are being freed in our hearts. And as we are free, we affirm that I am worthy. As we are free, we affirm that I am prosperous. As we are free, we affirm that I am more than enough. As we are free, we affirm that I am my brother's keeper. As we are free, we affirm that I am the light of the world. As we are free, we begin to affirm and invoke and speak to our I am nature, our God name, and remember who and what we are. And it is only from this knowing that we can change the planet. No missile has ever transformed anything on this earth. But it is from this knowing that light will overcome the darkness. This is the universal law. That we will change, transform, and awaken this planet. The desire is here, and it is bursting forth. It is pushing forward. So we lean in to this truth of ourselves. And as we know this truth of ourselves, we know it for each and every one of our brothers and sisters. We know it for our city. We know it for our country, for our state, for our nation, for this planet, for this solar system, for this galaxy, and the trillions of others. For this truth, I am so very grateful. I release this prayer now with joy and thanksgiving back into this law, which is always in operation. And together we say, amen, Ashe, and so it is.